First of all, I welcome all of the participants, all our students and alums who join us today for this talk, this discussion today that we have with Marisa Drew. Thank you very much to Professor Lahmann, Max Fischer, Hans-Christian Ehret for setting this up and organizing this. I'm very excited to have Marisa with us today because we have seen a growing relevance of impact and impact investing, and not only throughout the financial community, but also in our everyday lives, I would like to say. I see a couple of faces right now with whom I just yesterday in another format was discussing about impact and what that could mean for us as business students, business graduates. So I'm very happy to have one of the, let me say, leaders, thought leaders in that field with us today. Marisa Drew is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Global Head Sustainability Strategy of Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse, as you know, is one of the leading banks worldwide and one of the pioneers in this aspect. It is quite difficult to introduce you, Marisa, because you have accomplished so much in your career. So I actually had to write it down. You do have an MBA from a school, which we would love to have as a partner university, the Wharton School. And you have worked now in the financial services industry for over 30 years. But I think what sets you apart and what makes you a very specific or special, very special speaker today and discussant today is that you also in your life outside of Credit Suisse, you're doing a lot, including being a head in a couple of foundations. You're co-chair of the Diversity Leadership Council at Credit Suisse. You're working with the different forums or different working groups at the World Economic Forum. You're the founder of the Competitors Diversity Forum, a member of the C200, an organization comprised of the top women in business, a member, you're part of the Women's Leadership Board at Harvard. You have different other advisory board seats, and last but not least, the Fortune magazine placed you as one of the top 50 women in international business. So it's really an honor to have you with us today. But besides from those biographical information, we would be very interested to learn more about you, who you are, and how you got where you are. But before we delve into that, dear participants today, we love to have your questions as well. And we will use the first hour or so to discuss with Marisa on her experiences, on her viewpoint. But you are free, and please do so, to ask questions in the chat. Professor Lahmann and myself, we will monitor the chat. From time to time, we might bring in questions, but after an hour, we will open up the plenum and invite you to actually, come up stage and discuss directly with us. So if you have any questions before that, feel free to participate, to join us. So, let me start with a very broad and big question, Marisa. You have been active in impact investing for a very long time. How did you first get into that field in a time where, not everybody did have it on the radar?
Yes. Well, if I'm candid, first of all, thank you very much for the kind introduction. All of those things next to my name just means I've been around for a very, very long time. And I've got a lot of passionate interests that I try to pursue both inside and outside of work, which we can come on to later. But in terms of my journey in sustainability, it was very much something that I feel lucky in some respects because it was placed on my lap. I've had a 30-year career, as you said, in traditional investment banking. So I grew up in a very, very traditional linear way where I started in the business as an analyst and I worked my way up to be an associate, a vice president, and on up. Mostly focused on capital markets and raising capital for early stage high growth companies. It's been a personal passion of mine. I love this business because when you are providing what I call lifeblood capital for young businesses, you are incredibly important to them because oftentimes the access to capital is life or death for the company, but also you're a valued partner if you can provide that much needed support to them. So that's where most of my career has been. And of course, then as I grew more senior, I took on more businesses along the way. So I've run all of our capital markets businesses, our IPO businesses, our debt businesses, and so on. And then the last job before this one, which again was on quite a linear path, was running investment banking for EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So in addition to running capital markets, I also looked after our M&A practice and our industry and country coverage. And then a fateful thing happened, and that was the fall of 2017, where I walked out of a client meeting to find a message from my assistant from the group CEO of Credit Suisse. Now, most of the time, and I did not know our CEO very well because he was new to the organization, most of the time you don't have a call out of the blue for the CEO unless it's a bad thing. Usually if you're having a normal meeting, it's scheduled, months in advance. And this message, and so the first thing I thought was, uh-oh, what did I do wrong? And I returned the phone call, and my chief executive said, no, I bet you think there's something wrong. There's nothing wrong. There's something on my mind, and I would like you to fly to Zurich, and I'd like to have a chat about this topic. And so that began my journey. And in that meeting, he said that increasingly as he was interfacing with our clients of all types, whether they be individuals, institutions, or corporates, they were somehow grappling with the concept of sustainability in whatever way it was coming at them, either as an investor trying to put money to work doing something that has positive outcomes for the world, as a corporate trying to migrate the corporate business to make it more sustainable and what have you. And he said there's a real opportunity in business here to respond to the needs of our clients, and I think you should run this business. That was coming out absolutely out of the blue for me. It was not something that I had had in my frame of reference. And I must admit, I was a bit cynical at the time. This was back 4 some odd years ago, because I hadn't really spent that much time in this contextually as a business matter. Of course, I cared about the environment. Of course, I had very, very strong passions in terms of my philanthropy and things, but not as a business matter. So I actually was a bit cynical. And I thought, is there really a business here? Is this something for the CSR report, the social responsibility report? And I actually said to him, somewhat cheekily, if this is a marketing exercise for our CSR report, I'm a business builder. And, I said that. And we had this banter back and forth. And he said, no. I want you to do a bit of research on this topic and then come back to me after you've done that research and let me know what you think. And the thing that he planted, the seed he planted in my mind is he said, and by the way, what would you like your legacy in business to be? That was a very profound thing for me because I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about what is the culmination of 30 years in investment banking. And as I then dug into this space, and the more I researched, the more people I talked to, the more I digested, the more I came out of that exercise thinking there is a fundamental paradigm shift about the future of finance and how we think about finance, financial markets, and investments. And if the sum total of 30 years of investment banking and capital markets could be that I could be a part of mobilizing capital to solve some of the world's most intractable problems, what a great legacy that would be. And so at that moment, I said, I'm in, and I began the journey. And I went from running a very big business with, $1 billion budget and 1,000 people to actually running a startup, because this was just a nascent effort at the bank, a very, very different world. So we started with myself and my assistant and a white sheet of paper. And over the last 4 years, we've built quite a business. Now, I can't say that I built everything because we did have a great level of activity at the bank in sustainability in very specific pockets around the bank, but there was nobody that had the mandate to, as a global matter, to create a strategy around this and harmonize the activities that we were doing. And that was what I had the great privilege of being tasked with. So that's my story. And I must say, looking back 3 years later, I had no idea what I was walking into. And now we look today at the extraordinary amount of capital and enthusiasm and frankly, sheer necessity of having the corporate and the finance world respond to these great challenges of ours. And the need is so acute, particularly around climate change, to address this fast. So it is a necessary thing now as much as it is something that we aspire to. Oh, I think you're on mute.
The usual mistake. Thanks. Somebody put me on mute. I didn't do it myself. Quite impressive. Now, when preparing for this discussion today, I was wondering, as you said, there's a lot of traction in the market these days, and the question that always arises goes a little bit back to your CSR question. Do you feel that it is a mind shift of companies, of investors, or is it more driven by things like the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, ESG regulations, where organizations would say, well, I have to do it, so I do it?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a combination of factors. It's nuanced. It's never so simple as one thing. So let me address maybe a couple of those things that you raised. On the one hand, the UN Sustainable Development Goals formed a very, very seminal part of the sustainable finance movement. Why is that? Because what they did was they took the world's most challenging problems and they tried to categorize them into buckets that people could identify with. So whether it's environmental or social, there is a category for the things that people want to affiliate themselves with. It could be education or healthcare or saving the oceans or green energy or what have you. But they created that framework for talking about these topics. Mm-hmm. And by creating that framework, the other thing that they did is they allowed the academic and scientific community to say, if the goal of these UN 17 SDGs is to try to solve them, try to create some kind of an answer by 2030, the very next question, of course, is what's it going to cost? I come from finance. It's all about what's it going to cost? What's the investment required? And by asking that question and by putting great minds to that task, what they found was that with all, and typically I would say in the finance and business community, these sorts of problems were always perceived to be in the purview or the responsibility of government or perhaps philanthropy. It was not necessarily for the private sector. And when the math was done on these goals, what we realized is with all the government money in the world and with all the philanthropic capital in the world, there were still huge gaps, multi-trillion-dollar gaps per year between that point in time and 2030 to get there. So it was an absolute requirement for private capital to step in. So that's the UN SDG's role in all of this. But then in addition to that, I say there has been a great awakening in the concept of corporate purpose and this notion that the job of a corporation is only to make profits for shareholders, and there was only really one stakeholder that you were responsible to. I think the great awakening now of the corporate world is that we are responsible to many stakeholders. And if you take a holistic view of who your stakeholders are, your employees, your customers, your regulators, if that's appropriate, and of course your shareholders, number one, you are going to be a much better run company because you're attuned to all these various forces at work, and you're going to craft your business strategy and your way you deport yourself and who you think you're accountable to in a different way. And you're also going to be, I think, a little bit more attuned to what the trends and movements are, and you're able to respond. And we see this through the sustainability movement. Strong ESG companies, what we call the ESG leaders, have outperformed the laggards in virtually every industry and almost in a linear fashion. And we've seen the high ESG leaders be much more resilient in the time of a market shock like we just saw with COVID. So there's something here about the notion of a better run company, the concept of purpose, multi-stakeholder capital, and then this idea of purpose can drive outcomes. Again, back when I was getting taught Finance 101 at Wharton, we never thought that the purpose of a company was to do necessarily good in society. Of course, you wanted to be a good corporate citizen, but it wasn't part of the purpose. And now, once again, I think this awakening is purpose and profit aren't in two separate buckets. They are intertwined, and they can be mutually enhancing and reinforcing. And the final thing I would say is that, again, when I was taught finance at Wharton, we were taught essentially you looked at finance with a lens of risk and return. Everything was in the context of risk and return. And now this notion of risk, return, and impact So what is the impact of your investment and your dollar? What is it doing? What is it trying to accomplish? Is a very different lens and a different way to look at investments. And actually, I would posit the notion that if you look at this multi-tiered lens, the three lenses, you will become a better investor because you open your aperture and your lens to think a bit differently about the purpose and the impact of your capital. And so all of these things are happening at the same time. And then if you want to layer on top, I always say you want to be thinking about markets and drivers of markets with fundamentals. What are underlying trends that are going to support or drive a market going forward? And one that you touched on, Stephan, was regulation. So what are we seeing now proliferate across the world is regulation in response to addressing climate change. So on the one hand, I think companies themselves are saying, I need to do something about this. I need as a business matter to respond, whether it's to deal with climate change as a risk matter or an opportunity set. But equally, every politician and every regulator is saying it's a necessity. We've got to deal with this. And so regulation is coming fast and furious. You look at deals like the Green New Deal, Build Back Better, China saying they're going to reach net zero by 2050. By a country like China, the leaders saying, I want to do that, that is creating whole industries overnight because they're shifting their economy toward a green economy and changing the dynamic of what the composition is of that overall economy. And so these are very, very interesting topics for the finance community because number one, we need to finance that transition. We also want to finance those disruptive companies that are making change. And by doing that, we're creating enormous amounts of value for investors and for shareholders.
Okay. So I mean, I understand that impact is important in the terms, not just the financial impact, but also the impact that goes beyond the mere financial measures. A question that pops up then is, of course, I mean, how do you measure impact? And one term that I dropped over is the double delta of impact investing. It would be great if you could share your viewpoint on those two aspects. How do you measure and what double delta actually is?
Sure. Well, let me start with double delta because I think, and then I can come back to the impact. Because what double delta refers to, and this is a coin that a term that we've coined at Credit Suisse with one of my team members who got his PhD many years ago in the whole concept of impact and sustainability and stakeholder capital, is this notion that there are two levels of impact as an investor that you can think about. On the one hand, it is what we call Delta One, or the company's impact itself. What is the company doing with its products and services to create impact in the world? So as an example, if you invest in a green energy, wind and solar, by definition, the product and service of a wind or solar company is to deliver clean or green energy. Okay, so that's the company level or Delta One. What's interesting and not often talked about or well understood is the Delta Two piece, which is at the investor level. How can you drive impact? So you can do it, of course, by investing in an impactful company, but also you can use your power as a shareholder to drive and promote change. How do you do that? Well, as an investor, on the one hand, you could provide capital where capital is scarce, especially when you look at areas like the developing markets. If you are providing capital to a company that otherwise can't access that lifeblood of capital that we just talked about, that company may very well fail. So if you are the investor that's putting money into that business or that opportunity set, you are directly making an impact with your money. And I can contrast that as an example by if you were buying a share in a public company, you can make the argument that the impact is virtually nil because all you're doing is buying a share off of someone else. You're not creating impact by doing that. You're just swapping one share for another share if the company is already public. So it's a provocative way to think about your money and what is it driving outcomes. Now, I would also say, though, that as a Delta 2 thought process, it doesn't mean that if you're an investor in a public company that you can't drive outcome. The way you can drive outcomes is to use your power as a shareholder to try to engage with a company, to get its management team to work with you and respond to the things you care about. And something that is one of the fastest growing areas of this whole sustainable investing arena is this concept of shareholder engagement. What we're seeing right now is groups of shareholders coming together as a collective and going to companies and saying, this is what I expect of you. So let's take one example where we've seen a lot of activity in fossil fuels. We're seeing groups of institutional shareholders club together as a pact and going into the company management and board and saying, I need you to tell me that you're going to do something to reduce your CO2 emissions. And if you do that, I'll continue to hold your stock. But if you don't, I'm going to have to divest. That is a very powerful tool to get a company to transition its business model when you as a group of shareholders are saying, I want to see those outcomes. That is Delta 2 as well in the context of a public company. So hopefully that answered your question about how to drive impact, both in that way of investing in something that's already a company that's already doing good, or thinking at a Delta 2 level, how does my money really pursue the outcomes that I'm trying to achieve? And then your question about measuring impact. Very, very hard. Okay, I will be very candid and say that financial services industry is really wanting to put everything in a neat little bucket and put it in a quadrant and say it's all the same and measure it and compare it and contrast it. That is a very lofty goal, but it's also very challenging because every investment in impact might be trying to drive a different outcome. So it's probably worth just stepping back and saying, what do we mean when we say impact investing? We say an impact investment has three tenets to it. Number one, it is going to generate a financial return. Very, very important to make sure that this is not charity, where these are financial investments that generate returns. But number two, that investment is trying to be very deliberate in achieving a given outcome. It can be anything. If it's education, it could be getting kids in schools. If it is in water treatment, it's to reduce water leakage. It could be, again, a green energy opportunity where you're delivering, a truly CO2-free emissions green energy. And by being really deliberate with the investment, you're saying, I want to achieve an outcome, and I will hold myself accountable for that outcome, and I will measure that outcome and report on that outcome. So the reporting piece is the question that you're talking about. So if you just go back to some of the examples I gave, every investment that's an deep impact is trying to achieve something different. So how do I possibly compare an education outcome with an environmental outcome? You can't. They're completely different, right? So what you need to do is first ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish? And then measure the thing that you're trying to accomplish. I often say that as an impact investor, I need to pick one or two things that I'm trying to drive with that investment. I can't pick 50 things because I can't go into the manager or the CEO of a company and say, I expect you to manage 500 things. What you really want to say is, by investing in your company, I want to get kids in schools, or I want to deliver clean energy, or I want to provide healthcare access, and I'm going to measure that specific outcome with one or two metrics. And to me, that's good enough. If you're intentional with your capital and you're prepared to measure and hold yourself accountable, then that to me is the best way to think about this in a complicated space. And I'll give you one more example, which maybe illustrates the point even more. Let's just pick education for a second. There are many, many impact investments in education that want to drive different outcomes. So maybe one investment says, I want to get kids in schools in a developing country. Another one might say, I actually want to ensure that the curriculum that we're delivering is retained and understood by the students. And another impact investor might say, well, actually, the goal of my impact investment is to give the kids an education so that they can get a job at the end of their graduation. Every single one of those objectives is valid, but they're completely different. So I can't measure three different outcomes and say that they're the same. So that's why I say this is a complicated and quite subtle space, which is why, a lot of great minds are trying to figure out, is there some way to put some sort of standardization into the process so that you can compare and contrast? And I think we're early days in that journey today on measuring impact.
Regarding impact, I stumbled, or one aspect that I was looking at was very interesting for myself. The case of Danone and Emanuel Faber, which you certainly know about. It's a company where he put a lot of focus on sustainability in a company that is performed quite well, maybe not in the ESG leaders, but he was basically driven out of office as a CEO by a very active small investor saying, please leave us alone with all the sustainability talk. We want to see numbers. I don't know if you're familiar with that case, but that somehow was very puzzling for me in a world where you believe finally we have a CEO who says sustainability very authentically is important to me while doing business, and then an active investor comes and tells him there's the door. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Look, I can't, it's very difficult for me because I'm sure there are many, many reasons and subtleties to the outcomes that occurred there. What I would say is that today the investment community is very, very focused on trying to put capital into companies that they believe are ESG leaders because they genuinely believe that those companies will be more sustainable and more resilient over time. So that can be expressed either through the company is less risky because they're attuned to those issues that we talked about, or that the company has the great opportunity to create value or seize this opportunity associated with sustainability. That doesn't mean that every investor will see it the same way, and it doesn't mean that all these companies will survive and have longevity. Like I said, there's always nuance. I also say that being an early leader often is a very lonely place. So I could also point to companies like Unilever, the great Paul Pullman, who is one of the leaders in sustainability, driving during his tenure at Unilever the most extraordinary effort to move the company towards sustainability in belief that over the long term, it would create its raison d'etre and its own longevity and sustainability over time. There was a moment where he almost got pushed out of office as well, because that was coming at a bit the expense of return. And a lot of shareholders were saying, like you said, oh, the sustainability stuff, I don't care. Where are my short-term profits today? I do believe that, unfortunately, our financial system is still very much geared toward, if you're a public company, short-term results. It's quarterly results. And as we say, what have you done for me lately as an investor? But I will tell you that increasingly, though, the investment community is recognizing that these intractable problems that we have, there aren't short-term solutions. Every time you take a short-term solution on climate, you end up pushing the issue further away. And now we've gotten to a point where it's now urgent, and the action that we need to do to make the investments is critical. And that's going to come at an expense. But I think the astute investor is saying those investments will pay off over time. Let me give you one very small industry example. Early days of wind and solar. Those visionaries who said we can actually deliver wind and solar, green energy, and it will become the core of what is the next future of any sort of energy delivery. Those companies in the early days when they were starting out, most of the first round of companies, most of them went bankrupt. Part of that was because they were at the early phase of the industry life cycle. They had not reached a point of scale yet. So the only way they could survive is if there were government subsidies to buy that energy because it was too high priced relative to alternatives. But nobody, I can guarantee you, because I was financing some of those early companies in the day, nobody could have ever predicted that we would be in a world today, by being patient with that investment and that vision, that we'd be today in a place where wind and solar per unit of energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. That was sort of one of those things that was almost inconceivable. The price of wind and solar has dropped 85% in the last decade. And now what you're seeing is companies in the traditional industries who ignored that are ignoring that at their peril. We reached last year, for the first time in history, the fact that Exxon, which was one of the largest, most profitable, most highly valued companies in the world, fell out of the Fortune 50. Again, inconceivable 10 years ago. They've lost something like 500 billion of value over the last, annually over the last several years here, where the valuations of these alternative companies have exploded. So I think sometimes there has to be some patience exercised in this quest to ultimately do the right thing. But I'm hopeful, because we see so much capital moving into the field of sustainability, really driving these outcomes, that they are pushing for these better solutions and more thoughtful, as I say, multi-stakeholder considerations versus just a short-term quarterly profit.
You mentioned climate, and I'm totally in line with you that apart from the pandemic that we have at the moment, the climate issues are the ones that are most pressing, and you highlighted it a couple of times in your introduction already. So what are the different trends in your industry to counter that? I mean, because money in the end has a guiding effect. So what is the financial industry doing here?
Well, every single industry is grappling with how do they become more sustainable and address climate change. And I say it is two sides of a coin. On the one hand, if you are not climate aware, you do that at your peril, because the risks of climate, it can be physical risk in your real estate or risk in your supply chain. I mean, we see this constantly now with the increasing storm activity and proliferation of these extreme weather events. Again, I say, if you look back, not even more than 5 years ago, what was the most precious real estate in the world? It was always coastal real estate. The most expensive houses were the ones on the coast. Now, people are looking at this saying, I need to look at this as a risk. The possibility of the loss of value of having a coastal home when sea levels are predicted to rise 3 meters within our lifetime, maybe I need to look at this in a very, very different way. So on the one hand, every industry is grappling with the risk issue, but also those very smart companies are seizing the opportunity. And so what we're seeing happen is literally industry by industry, they are asking themselves, what are the effects of climate change on my business, both physical risk, but also what are the opportunities, and how do I participate? Now, the most activity, I would say, or the sort of urgent activity, and there's pressure from regulators and investors and consumers, is on the highest carbon emitting industries, because those, of course, are the ones that have the greatest contribution to global warming. And there is an enormous amount of both capital that is being put to work in what we call the corporate transition. So this is mature industries that are high carbon emitters that are making investments to migrate their business. I mean, I'm sure all your students are studying the phenomenon, but you're seeing traditional fossil fuels companies saying things like, I am going to be a clean energy company. I am transitioning. BP, my whole future of my business is to transition or migrate. And it's not just fossil fuels companies. The top 10 carbon emitting industries are building materials, transportation, automobiles. So if you go one by one, and the food system, right? The way we produce, consume, and waste food today is not sustainable for a planet of 11 billion people. And by the way, I don't want to suggest that the E is the be all end all, because E and S, environmental and social, are very, very interlinked. We know that the environmental considerations are going to affect people most of all. And we need to figure out how do we protect and support people in the face of climate change. But in any case, every single industry is grappling with this. And so what are we seeing? We think to get to ultimately what we call the nirvana state, which is net zero carbon emissions. And we need to do that to keep the planet at 1.5 degrees, which is sort of where the climate scientists are telling us we need to be to have a livable planet in future. We need to get pretty much every industry to commit to net zero by 2050. Now, today, there aren't always pathways to do that. So we know today that there are alternatives, of course, for energy. You've got wind and solar and other things now that are surfacing. But in places like aviation, in airplanes, we don't yet have a green fuel. But there are huge amounts of efforts and lots of capital being spent to find those alternative pathways. And I'm very hopeful because we think there'll be technological innovation that's coming. We see it every day. So something like green hydrogen will become one of the new things, the new sources of clean and green energy. Of course, we're seeing the vehicle electrification movement. It's not going to be in the distant future where we will not have petrol-fueled cars anymore. You see, China has said they will ban petrol vehicles within 5 years. Mm. That is a profound statement in an emerging economy of 300 million people who all aspire to have a vehicle and have a personal car. So these are the kinds of trends and things that we're seeing just go at a pace. But it's not only capital. So we need investment to transition, okay, on the one hand. We think to get to net zero, what is it going to take? About a third must come from innovation. A third is going to come from simple things like process improvement. So fix leaky pipes and turn off, replace your bowls with something more efficient. So it's an efficiency game. And the other third, frankly, is individual responsibility. Us taking responsibility to reduce our own consumption. We've got to play a part as individuals. So there's a corporate issue to here, there's a finance issue, there's a government issue, but there's also individual responsibility to ultimately get to net zero. But anyway, it's very, very exciting. And I am a big believer in human ingenuity to solve the most complicated problems. And if I'll point to one of the exciting places that I get very, very enthusiastic about, every day I'm meeting entrepreneurs that have come up with businesses to solve these big problems. They're very, very mission driven. These are impact businesses. But one, just to give you an example in the food system, today our desire to eat meat truly isn't sustainable. We know beef in particular is highly, highly polluting. It leads to deforestation, methane production in the air. Unfortunately, the way we're raising beef is not necessarily healthy because of some of the hormones and antibiotics that we're giving those animals and so on. So one of the great innovations that is just about to happen and become commercial is growing meat and seafood from the stem cells of animals and fish. So effectively, it's called cultivated or lab-grown meat and seafood. I don't mean plant-based like the Beyond Meat burgers and things that you're seeing in the supermarkets and fast food chains today. It is to be able to do this. Now, the reason that this is happening is to solve climate problems. The scientists and the entrepreneurs here are saying, if I could create something without compromise, so you get to eat your meat or your fish, but it doesn't take any water, it doesn't take any land, there are no hormones and antibiotics. And if I can get it to something that's commercially viable, that could have a profound effect, not only on human health, but for sure the environment. So this is the sort of trend and innovation that I'm seeing with entrepreneur after entrepreneur saying, I want to deliberately tackle this problem, and I'm going to create a business around it. And those make great investments.
The augmentation line that you just built up is very elaborate. You're thinking behind the corners. I would like to take the opportunity to combine 2 or 3 questions that we have in the audience, because there's one question that came up from Hannah, who asked, how do you deal with the long-term impact? You mentioned fossil fuel, we were moving away from combustion engines to electric engines. And you would say, instinctively, you would say, well, that's great, that's good for the environment. But at the same time, you need minerals for that, like the rare minerals. And this may lead to large-scale mineral mining, deforestation, child labor, etc. We've seen these headlines in the news. And I would like to combine that with the question, how do you deal with that? Do you look at what's coming behind the corner, and how do you do that? And second, our colleague, Andreas Suchanek, posed a question. He's our business ethics professor. And impact could also be, Google framed that many years ago when they said, do no harm.
Yes.
Right? What is about doing no harm by basically not looking for a positive impact, but trying to avoid bad impact?
Yes.
How do you deal with these issues?
So maybe I'll address the first question first, which is this notion of the seeing around corners and how do you think through these issues. You're absolutely right that let's just take electric vehicles. Today, half of my investors will say that investing in a company like a Tesla or any other electric vehicle company, they will put that in their green or sustainable bucket. The other half of my investors and my clients will say, until battery technology is truly clean and isn't reliant on base minerals, which are obviously, as you say, coming from mineral mining practices, which usually are not sustainable, they won't put it in their bucket. And this is where this gets complicated when we talk about impact, and green, it's in the eye of the beholder oftentimes. I can't tell either client that they're right or wrong. It becomes something that it's a personal value to them. So I guess what I would say to people who are trying to follow a sustainability investment theme, you need to determine for yourself, what are the things that you care about and how do you want to inform yourself? I think the biggest challenge is oftentimes people piling into things based on sound bites and not informing themselves. And then you end up with unintended consequences. But I also do, though, sometimes think that you need to be a little bit forgiving in the quest to achieve a very, very visionary outcome. No different than Paul Pullman with his vision for Unilever, and maybe be willing to take some short-term profit hit in order to achieve that big vision. Elon Musk at the start, everyone thought he was a crazy man, and look where he is today in terms of the delivery, with this massive, kind of wave toward vehicle electrification and making it commercial. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue to challenge yourself. And I know for a fact that every day, those who are in the electric vehicle arena are saying, yes, my grand vision is ultimately to create an electric vehicle which is clean, but every day I'm pushing myself for better battery technology. The investments that are going there are big. And there are component parts manufacturers that are doing that. So I think sometimes you want to set your big vision, and then you have to ask yourself, is the end game worth maybe a little bit of dissension in the middle to achieve that outcome? But I don't give myself a free pass and say, just because I'm going to get to green means that I can pollute along the way. So it's complicated. These are very nuanced topics, but I do think that I'm very aware of what I'd call the entire value chain, and what your footprint of your value chain is, not just environmentally, but socially, leads you to ultimately be an informed investor, but also an activist investor. Back to this shareholder engagement topic. If something doesn't sit well with you in that process, then you should use your power as a shareholder to try to drive change, and or a consumer. And one of the things I'm very encouraged by, and it's really the generation of your students, is that I never, when I was growing up, even thought about asking a company what its environmental footprint was or its social policies before I bought its goods and services. Never thought about it. But your generation does that every single day. And by using the power of your consumer wallet, even if you don't have money to invest yet, you will, but even if it's not there today, you're a powerful force. You see it all the time with the influencer crowd saying that I don't like a company's environmental footprint or its plastic packaging. You're basically driving the change that you want to see in the companies because you're demanding that as a consumer. So there's multiple ways also to drive impact as well. I don't only mean to suggest that it's by finance. So hopefully that answered your question, but it's not a simple, straightforward answer.
Yeah, that's true. When discussing, I feel that, or my perspective is that the financial industry is actually very, very far ahead in understanding or analyzing the whole topic. Is it a notion that you would share? Because when I talk to companies from different industries, I feel the discussions that I have with the financial services industry very often is way more advanced than for a typical manufacturing industry.
Yeah.
Company.
I think that almost by necessity, because we are stewards of people's capital, and those who give us money are asking those very same things that we just described that consumers are asking. They will come to an asset manager and say, I want to know what you're doing with my money. Are you investing it sustainably? And they're beginning to ask these questions. So if we are going to be a fiduciary for that capital, we better have answers for that. And we better have solutions. If the client's coming to us and saying, I want you to invest my money in sustainable ways, or sometimes it will be along UN sustainable development themes. I have so many clients saying, as an example, and this took us down a path to really study what we could create and do to help our oceans. I had so many clients, particularly the next generation of our clients, saying, I deeply care about the ocean. I'm bothered by the fact that I see these pictures of the littered beaches and the dying fish and so on. But how do I express that in an investable format? That drives us there. So I think in some ways that caused us to be ahead. And in the corporate world, oftentimes, you're sort of doing what I say, your day job. Your head is down, you're running the business the way you've always run it. And some of this noise in the background is something that you're not necessarily attuned to. On the other hand, back to my original comment at the beginning of our conversation, is that those companies that are aware, that are open to these ESG issues, and increasingly that is the case, whether it's by necessity because they're getting pressure, or whether it's that you have forward leadership, they're beginning to ask themselves these questions. And by doing that, they are changing their business models. So I do think that the corporate world in some cases is very far ahead. Look at all those mission-driven entrepreneurs I was just describing, the cultivated meat and seafood people, the green energy companies, all those companies are very far ahead. They're the disruptors. But then of course, in every business cycle, you'll have disruption and you'll have mainstream industry. And the question is, how quickly does mainstream be aware of that disruption and either migrate to address it or adopt it or face the threat of extinction? We've seen that time, you all have studied all the cases of the horse and buggy and versus the car, or the Kodak moment, or whatever those moments in history are. So I do think the leaders with blinders on do face the threat of extinction and disruption. The only other thing I wanted to touch on is in the investment community, what are the signs of a maturing and scaling financial market is when you have a commonality of language. And one of the issues that the impact investing arena and the overall sustainable investing arena has been faced with is that there isn't one single definition of green or sustainable or impact. And so what we're trying to do as an industry is set standards and try to have a harmony of definitions of what are these different investing strategies that you could use, and try to get a broad market adoption so that when we're talking about sustainability or impact or ESG, we're using the same language. We're not there yet, but through my career of being 30 years in capital markets, I see these kind of cycles come. And the way ultimately you get to a mature, scaled financial market or asset class is when you do have a single language. So today you asked a question about what about this if you want to avoid things? We call that exclusions. So that's a very valid investing strategy, which just says, I do not want to hold in my portfolio any companies that don't align with my values. And that could be, anything from gaming or fossil fuels or tobacco or what have you, all the way through to the impact strategies, which say, not only do I want to avoid, but I actually want to deliberately make change with my money. And that's when we get into the world of impact. And everything in between, there are strategies all across what we call the financial spectrum. And what we're trying to do, as I say, is to create a common language so people know where they can participate in those different buckets, depending on what they want to achieve.
You touched one point that I stumbled over as you were talking about it. We're talking a lot about green economy, etc., but there's also the blue economy, the oceans. And very personally, I can relate a lot to, we have to stop deforestation, we have to do something about microplastics, etc. But somehow the oceans, I have the feeling or the perception, everybody knows something is not right there. But as an individual, as a person, as a consumer or investor, I lack somehow some ideas how severe the problem is and what we can do about it.
Yes. I'm so pleased that you asked that question, because it's an absolute personal passion of mine. The way I have thought about building my business is I've challenged our teams to use those UN Sustainable Development Goals as a lens through which we look at ways that we could help change the equation at Credit Suisse. And on the one hand, I say I'd like my teams to be doing more of what's already good and what's working. So maybe mobilize capital for things like wind and solar, which we just need more of. But I also challenged our teams to go to places that were underinvested. So where private capital has not gone before, and challenge ourselves to see whether we could innovate and change the equation. And when we did that exercise, that led us to SDG 14, life below water or the oceans. Because when we did some research into that topic, I think intuitively we knew how important oceans are. But just to give you a few facts, Oceans give us every second breath we take, meaning that they provide 50% of the world's oxygen. They also take more than a quarter of the carbon emissions out of the atmosphere. So they are a huge sink for carbon emissions. They also have a huge and important role to cooling the temperatures. So if you didn't have oceans, our global warming would be off the charts in terms of the temperature increases. And then the other things that maybe you, again, intuitively know, but don't always appreciate, the oceans, if you were to add them up, livelihoods associated with the oceans, it's the 7th largest economy in the world. And people don't think about oceans in GDP terms, but when you start to think about it in those terms, all of a sudden you say, well, maybe this is an investable area. So when we looked at this, we realized that the UN, that the oceans were the 2nd least invested of the UN SDGs. And we said, we've got to change that equation. So our first step was to actually pull the investment community and ask them the question, do you care about investing in the oceans? If yes, have you invested in the oceans? If no, why not? And what we got back from this very exhaustive study that we did with an organization called Responsible Investor is that the short answer is that we found that most investors say, of course I'd like to invest in the ocean. Just like you, I care about the ocean. But the reason I'm not invested is because no one's ever presented me with an investment opportunity in the space, or nothing that actually speaks to me as an investor for my own risk tolerance or the own things I care about. So that's led us to say we're going to change that equation. So we have over a 2-year period, we really did a great deal of research and thinking and idea generation. And we came out the other side creating investment opportunities for our clients to invest behind themes such as aquaculture, sustainable aquaculture. So, obviously changing the equation, because if fish are a source of protein for 1/4 of the world, they rely on fish as the primary source of protein, yet the waters are way overfished. We need to find sustainable ways of growing and building fish. And that could be cell-based aquaculture, like we just talked about with the cultivation, or it could be just more traditional aquaculture sources in water or even on land. And there are very sustainable ways to do that. Offshore energy, wind and solar offshore energy. The oceans provide an enormous source of energy. There are so many sectors like this. Data mapping of the ocean is a serious business now. Companies like Google and the Moonshot Factory at Google X has an amazing business that maps the bottom of the ocean so we can learn things like fish migration patterns, so we can be much smarter about the way we fish and handle the precious stocks that are left. And I could go on and on and on and on. But that allowed us to create investment products that say, you know what, these are very serious and high potential, high value add businesses. So if we can just create an investment opportunity for our clients, we think that they would love this opportunity. And of course, when you get the right structure and the right thematic and present it the right way, the capital is there. And we were very pleased when we launched a fund not that long ago in the fall of last year called the Ocean Engagement Fund. We found that it had tremendous reception from our clients. And we've been able to mobilize hundreds of millions of capital just in that investment strategy, which is completely directed at ocean health. So it can be done. It just takes a little bit of ingenuity and, shall I say, grit with rolling up your sleeves and trying to figure out some of these intractable problems. But this is where the excitement comes. You know, when you ask me what sort of drives me and where my passion lies, I'm very proud of the fact, because I would tell you 5 years ago, if someone said through an investment strategy you could mobilize a couple $100 million of private capital for the ocean, people would have said, you're crazy. It can't be done. And here we are. So this is what gives me a lot of energy and hope that those 2030 goals are achievable within reach if we put our mind to it and get the finances right.
Thank you. Marisa, I think Alex has conducted a couple of polls and would like to present you with a viewpoint of our audience today. Okay.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Stephan. We have many polls already collected, and there's one specific, because you've touched the topic of the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. Now, our question was, do you think that this is still reachable?
I will tell you that it is a challenge. So it is not easy. but I do believe it is reachable. We participate, and I am a commissioner of something called the Energy Transitions Commission. And if your students are interested in reading about the ETC, Energy Transitions Commission, I would highly recommend it, because the ETC is a think tank that is some of the smartest academics and scientists in the world that took a look at the highest carbon emitting industries over a multi-year period and tried to do the analytics and the math to say, is it possible? Is it possible to reach net zero, which is essentially where we need to get to maintain the 1.5 degree Paris alignment? And after all that work, they didn't prejudge it, so it wasn't a foregone conclusion, but that out of all that work, they came out the other side of that exercise, and they created a report called Mission Possible, i.e. it is possible to do. And they have been very, very systematic and rigorous by looking at each of the individual high carbon emitting industries and mapping how to get there, what's it going to cost, what does it need, what do we need to do? And that report in and of itself, as well as all of the participants who are supporters of the ETC, it's allowed us to both drive finance, to drive the corporate response, to help push innovation, and to help policymakers direct where they ought to be putting policy and regulation in place. So let me give you one example as an outgrowth of that. So I can give you numerous examples, but one that is very, very real and here and now is something that just got announced last week in the US. With the Biden administration, of course, who are taking a seriously a bold stance in their climate ambitions and the investment in green infrastructure, they've come out and they've said that they will redirect $35 billion of subsidies, which used to support the fossil fuel industry, and they're going to redirect those to clean energy. That is a massive, massive thing, because some parts of some of these high carbon emitting industries have benefited from a lot of propping up of by governments. And if they didn't have those subsidies, they actually wouldn't be profitable businesses, so they would be unsustainable. So the idea of policymakers redirecting and providing the nudges and the investment sort of landscape that will allow capital to flow or push capital flow are the kinds of things that I get very excited about, in addition to what I would call just the general disruption that's taking place and so on. So yes, the short answer to your question is that I believe it is possible. It is not going to be easy, but when I look at the enormous amounts of capital that are being mobilized toward climate, it's far surpassed anything that I could have expected 3 years ago when I got into the sustainability field. There are hundreds of trillions of dollars now that are basically heading in that direction. I mean, today, the overall sustainability field, depending on which source you use, is somewhere between 50 and 100 trillion. But every day we see more and more asset managers saying that they are going to migrate 100% of their portfolio towards sustainable investing, i.e., towards climate and environmental and social solutions. And so with that power, alongside, as I say, that human ingenuity, I think will be.
Then let us, Marisa, if you would allow, check our poll. What did the audience say?
Okay. I have something sort of in the middle of my screen here. I can't see it. Let's see.
So let me read it out. So yes, we are already on a good track. 0 persons have answered this or have chosen it. Yes, but a huge combined effort is necessary, which accounts for 65% of the answers, and 35% of the answers say no. No matter the effort, the damage done is already too severe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to see that there's hope in the audience.
Me too.
I guess what I've always said is that when something becomes an absolute necessity, it's a matter of survival or extinction. It's remarkable how quickly things move. Genuinely, I never thought, as I said, in my lifetime, I would see some of the things that we're seeing. That you'd see a country essentially saying they're going to ban petrol cars. That was inconceivable even 5 years ago, and look at where we are today. So that's what gives me hope. And I think, the closer the reality of climate change gets to people, the more it excites them to action. The very sad thing is, if you study human nature, humans are wired to see things very close in front of them. It's hard for humans to think 20, 30 years out, even though people knew that climate change was happening 20 years ago. It just felt so far away and it was someone else's problem. But when it is your house that's underwater or your property that is being affected by wildfires, all of a sudden this becomes very real to you, and it incites you to action. And I think that's a little bit of what we're seeing, that sense of urgency.
Okay.
By the way, the other thing I would point to is if you just stroll the news leading up to COP26, the Paris Climate Accord meetings that will happen in the fall of this year. It used to really be just an intergovernmental exercise. That's what the Paris Climate Accord was before, 220 governments saying that they would commit to try to keep us at 1.5 degrees. Now, if you look at the news, look at the number of corporate announcements of commitments to net zero targets. It is just proliferating and it's accelerating apace. Most large corporates, virtually all of the large banks, including Credit Suisse, we have committed ourselves by 2050 to get to net zero. And that's net zero across all of our own businesses, our footprint, but also our operations, which is what you call scope 3, which is very, very hard to do, but we've made a public commitment to get there. And I can tell you, I've got whole teams of people working on how are we going to get there? How are we going to make that happen?
We would like to open up the round now. So while everybody can consider questions that they want to ask it directly, let me go back a little bit to the beginning of our conversation before we invite the first participants up here. You mentioned yourself 4 years ago, you thought that this is a CSR marketing gag. How did you encounter the organization? Because I believe you were not the only one with that understanding. How did it work out that you built this business within Credit Suisse?
It's a very, very good question. When you're trying to drive change in and across an organization, it's a hard thing to do. I was fortunate in some ways because I have spent a long time running big businesses of the organization. So I was a known commodity, shall we say, within the bank. I must tell you that there are many people that said things like, boy, I thought she was a serious business person. Has she lost the plot? She went to the dark side. I didn't realize she was, one of those greenies, all those kinds of silly things people began to say. But at the same time, they knew that I had had a long career trajectory running very serious businesses for the bank and making good profits for the bank and so on. And so even when they might have been a little bit like, what happened to her? They were a little curious. And just that curiosity to understand, what was it about this space that captured my attention, opened the door for me to have the conversation. And then I set about, and I will tell you probably for the first 18 months of building this business, I felt like most of my time was agitating for change, trying to raise awareness, educating people on the things that I had learned, and in some ways showing them, shall I say, the carrot, meaning the opportunity set, by seizing this moment. If they believe or even half believe that I was right, look at the enormous opportunity as a financial institution to finance our clients' transition. That's going to require trillions of dollars of investment, or the opportunity to connect in a more visceral way with our private clients. When you talk about sustainability matters or value systems, you connect in a very different and deep personal way with your families. It's not just a transaction or a tax issue. It is something about the core of the family and what the family stands for. And those early adopters of those messages of my peers, all of a sudden they then were a little bit like me. They educated themselves. They saw the benefit of adopting some of these principles and these ideas, and then they saw it manifest itself in their client engagement. And then all of a sudden they were the ambassadors for all of this. So change in a big complex organization happens slowly. But not only did I use the carrot, I also used the stick, if I'm very honest. I also said, there's a thread here that if you don't do it, somebody else will. And in a business environment, there's always a little competitive tension across the peer group. So I use whatever tools. I'm shameless in using whatever tools work. But it took me about 18 months, I think, to spread the word and to have it take hold. Now, I also was benefited by the fact that the markets came my way. there's been this explosion. I'm sure you of course see this. You can't pick up a newspaper, you can't see a television program without somebody talking about sustainability or climate change or any of these topics. And so the market has also sort of matured at the same time that I was trying to spread this word. So there's a little bit of luck here and a whole lot of determination. And about 18 months in, I feel like I reached a tipping point from always being that person who was pushing. And it went from a push at that tipping point to now a pull. Now everybody wants to engage. How can they, take our time? How can we get smarter? How can we show our clients? And that's a beautiful place to be. I feel like, a little bit mission accomplished.
Yeah. I believe that was quite a journey, challenging journey. Glad that you made it that far. We have a couple of very interesting questions as far as I see. Vero, why don't you come up first and pose your question to Marisa?
Sure, I would be happy to. It's a pleasure to meet you. By the way, amazing talk. My question is related to how do you evaluate and consider backing projects that deal with social innovation, because environmental impact is a lot harder to measure, either trees saved or hectares protected or whatever. It's a lot easier to measure environmental projects than social. So yeah, how do you deal with that?
It's a wonderful question. I'm so glad you raised it, and you're absolutely right. I will tell you that even a year or so ago, the topic of the S in ESG was definitely subsidiary to the E. I mean, everything was about the E, and you're right. And part of that is just because climate is urgent, but B, it's easier to measure. And I think that when people thought about social issues, they thought of them as soft and a little bit amorphous. And what does that really mean, social and so on? Then what happened was we had this little thing called COVID-19, the pandemic. And during this moment in time, I think it somewhat shocked people, the inequities in the world that have surfaced. I mean, whether it's Black Lives Matter or the sort of gross inequities that are surfacing between wealth divide, even access to online education and this sort of a thing, it shocked people. And maybe, somehow in the back of their minds, they knew that all of this existed. But when it was made so acute and real for people, I think the natural human reaction to suffering in the pandemic was to do something about it. And all of a sudden that catapulted the S topic way up to the top of the list. At the same time, I also think that this moment, I say the penny dropped, or the aha moment happened, where the investment community realized that the E and the S are intertwined. So even something like the pandemic, the fact that we have a pandemic and the fact that we're facing this health issue, a serious health issue across the world, what was that a byproduct of? In some respects, man-made issues like deforestation, where you're going to have more human-animal contact. So that connection was made. So all of a sudden, people are saying, I need to think about S in isolation, but I also need to think about the combination of the E and the S, because also climate change will disproportionately affect those who are, unfortunately, the least able to deal with it in the world. And so that's created a spur to action. And now what I'm pretty excited about is that there are so many people that are focused on the S topic and being very precise with measuring S outcomes. So if you think about just the UN SDGs again, what are the S topics? It's gender equality, it's no poverty, it is education, it's access to healthcare, and so on. And so with a lot of great academic and scientific minds, people are trying to measure and isolate in a very rigorous and quantitative way S outcomes. And let's say this is a journey, but the mobilization of capital toward this is the first step, because the enthusiasm of people wanting to invest behind it, they're going to demand that we have some good quality measurement. And we're seeing it every day. But to give you a couple of thoughts, one of the things that in hindsight, as people went back and tried to unpack some of the ESG leaders, one of the things that they found, and Credit Suisse just put out a researcher piece last week that found that the highest performing ESG leaders, the disproportionate effect of their outperformance was the S, the fact that they were leaders on S. And I think that there's something provocative here, and a lot of the research analysts are trying to unpack this a little bit. But my theory is the following, that what we've seen through the crisis is those companies who did things, who are empathetic even to things like employee relations, captured the hearts and minds of their customers and their employees. So, companies that I say that were very, very, exhibit a lack of empathy, maybe, fired 500 people by a Zoom call, that they were right in the sightlines of the viral influencers who said, how dare this company treat people this way? And that's a long road to come back from when you hurt your reputation that way. And that's an S topic. And now what the investment community is saying, some of the markers that I think for good hygiene before I'm going to invest, I'm going to now look at companies' labor policies. I'm going to look at their equal pay policies. I'm going to look at things like health and welfare programs, because my view is that if companies are good on those topics, they will disproportionately attract the best talent, and they're going to have more loyal customers because people like you are asking those questions now, whether as a consumer or as an investor. And so it's almost becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the measurement piece is coming, almost in lockstep. But the more exciting piece to me is the recognition that as topics really matter in terms of value, driving value or creating resiliency in companies. And that's pretty cool stuff. And the really bad examples, and there are some case studies about if you don't get it right, the destruction of value is the corollary to that. In the UK, one example that gets often cited, but it's a pretty good case example, was a company called Boohoo, a fashion company. It was a darling of the sort of investment community because they had performed very, very well in what's already been a troubled fashion world and a retail industry. And then a news headline hit the tape that they had potentially really bad predatory labor practices. Within something like 6 hours of that news hitting the tape, that company lost $1 billion in value. I mean, literally, the investors just went, I don't want any part of a company. And they're going to have to prove to me whether this is wrong or right. They almost reacted on the news. And then their suppliers said, I'm not going to supply you. And this whole thing took on a life of its own. And that's just one of those moments where, people woke up and said, better get this S thing right. And it really matters. So anyway, that's a very interesting development over the last year in particular.
Information overload, I have to say. You have so much to share, and I'm so grateful for having you with us. Time is almost up. Please allow me one last question.
Okay.
Just from your perspective, and you've seen a lot, is there one piece of advice that you would give the students, like the younger generation today, with regards to what you're passionate about?
Well, I can never give you one. I give you two. One is would be that if this is your passion and you want to somehow get involved in sustainability for your career, there are going to be so many job opportunities over the coming, this is not going to go away anytime soon, over the coming decades, that it's an exciting place to be. My piece of advice always to those who are starting out their career is to, if you haven't, obviously you want to follow the passion and something that you care about, because by definition, it feels a whole lot less like work if you're happy, pursuing that field. But within that context, I also always say, if you are trying to figure out where to drive your career, go where the growth is. Almost by definition, in a growing industry, it will continue to create opportunity. And that is an exciting place to be. And in a fast growing field, you tend to get a lot of responsibility early, right? Because it's moving so fast, people are trying to grapple with all that's coming at them. And the trajectory of the sustainability field is literally straight up. And it's a necessity, which is why I don't think it's going to go away, and all those trends and things that we talked about. So it's an exciting place to be. Open your eyes to opportunity. If you want to be a lawyer, there are legal fields in sustainability. If you want to be a banker, you can be an investor. You can be the person who creates investments. You can be a relationship manager, advising those who invest. If you care about just really rolling up your sleeves and being involved in sustainability as an NGO, there are just so many opportunities to create a great career for yourself and to be a part of the movement. The second thing that I would say, if there's another piece of advice, is that sometimes these big world problems seem like that how could you possibly have an impact, you as an individual? And just remind yourself that, back to my point on getting to net zero, A third of the answer to global net zero is our own behavior. The things that you do day to day, the choices that you make as a consumer, what packaging you use, what questions you ask. So try to become as informed as you can be. Don't be susceptible to the sound bites that lead you to jump on a wave without being informed. But if you are informed, then take action. Be your own activist, because you can drive those outcomes even if you don't have a single dollar or euro or Swissie of capital. Your behavior can create enormous impact. So I'll leave you with that, hopefully, as a bit of inspiration and a pearl of wisdom. And I wish all of you great luck in your ambitions and your careers, and hopefully it'll involve sustainability in some form or fashion, whether it's as an individual or in your career.